Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and today I'm going to go into Book 6 of Plato's Laws. Now, the translation I've been using is by Robert Greg Burry, and I've been using the Loeb Classical Library series. For those of you who don't have access to this book, you can find it online if you do a search for the title and put PDF in your search. Okay, I'm going to go ahead here now. We're looking in Book 6, and what we're doing in Book 6 here is now we have finished that whole preliminary stage, and now we're getting into the main practice. And so what Plato is going to focus on here is the condition of the soul at this stage in our journey. So he's going to start by talking about the magistrates. And remember that in this analogy of the city-state to the soul, the magistrates represent that wisdom-loving part of the soul. Okay, he says, well then, after all that has now been said, you will next come, I suppose, to the task of appointing magistrates for your state. And in this there are two branches of civic organization involved. First, the appointment of magistracies and magistrates, with the fixing of the right number required and the proper method of appointment. And next, the assignment to each magistracy of such and so many laws as are in each case appropriate. Okay, so that's where we're going. Now, the first thing he says about the wisdom-loving part of the soul is that it must be fully tested. So remember that at this point, we have already passed that initial purification. So this is like if this was think of the allegory of the cave. We've already stood up from our chains, from our seated position, staring at the shadows on the wall, and we have worked our way over to that steep incline that leads to the exit of the cave. So now we are well on that incline, working our way out of the cave, building understanding. Perhaps some of you are even already feeling the sunlight in the upper world. So we have already been testing ourselves. He goes on to say that those who are to be the selectors should have been reared in law-abiding habits and be well trained for the task of rightly rejecting or accepting those candidates who deserve their approval or disapproval. So what he's describing, what they should have already done, that is like that initial cleansing, the music and gymnastics. That was the initial cleansing. So now we have been brought up with right opinion, if our parents were philosophical themselves, or perhaps we cleared away a lot of the false beliefs that we'd been raised on and we have taken on more right opinion. But either way, we have learned law-abiding habits, as he calls them here, and we have some experience then sifting through our beliefs and seeing which ones we want to hold on to, which ones serve us well, which ones don't, or which ones don't serve us anymore and we want to toss out. This much at least is plain, Clinias, to almost everyone, even to the meanest intelligence, that they will not readily accept any of those laws at the start. But if those laws could remain unchanged until those who have imbibed them in infancy and have been reared up in them and grown fully used to them, have taken part in elections to office in every department of state, then, when this has been effected, if any means or method can be found to effect it rightly, we have, as I think, a strong security that after this transitional period of disciplined adolescence, the state will remain firm. So what I take out of this is that once we have that initial cleansing, once we have gotten on that path, if you will, that steep incline getting us out of the cave, once we're on that path, then the state will remain firm, and we're more likely then to stay with philosophy. Also, what I think of when I read this is the idea that philosophy is a way of life, that we're not just learning a bunch of certain ideas. These are not just intellectual theories to toss around for fun. This is a way of life, and when you truly embrace it, it molds you. It's not just about your outward behavior. It's about changing your very state of mind, your way of being. And so it requires a certain familiarity. And it takes time then, for this to become your true way of being. Take the utmost care that the first officials are appointed in the best and most secure way possible. The selection of the rest of them will be a less serious task, but it is imperatively necessary for you to choose your law wardens first with the utmost care. Again, this idea of planting the right seeds, of getting that right start. So that first stage, it's I think people are very excited to go up that steep incline and develop understanding. But really that initial cleansing is key. It is very, very important, because if you have the right start, then you're far more likely to find success later on, to have an easier time. Not that it's ever easy, but it's easier if you have that right start. And with that in mind, he says this: as the saying goes, well begun is half done. And everybody always commends a good beginning. But it is truly, as I think, something more than the half. And no one has ever yet commended as it deserves a beginning that is well made. Again, planting the right seeds is imperative. He gives at 754d, he gives us two different names for the tasks of the magistrates. And this matches very nicely to the two names given to those people who represent the wisdom-loving part of the soul in the Republic. In the Republic, he calls them rulers and guardians. And we see here they're wardens of the laws and keepers of the registers. I like the idea of wardens of the laws. It fits this dialogue very nicely because he has already made it clear that these rulers are not actually acting necessarily from their own insight separate from the divine. What they are is actually conduits to divine wisdom that flows into them. And then they are like supervisors who oversee this wisdom passing to the rest of the soul, if you will. That's sort of the imagery that he has here. And so calling them wardens of the laws fits very nicely. But then also they're called keepers of the registers, because in addition to being rulers, the guardians is the other role that we learned in the Republic. And we see that it is also the task of the wisdom-loving part of the soul to maintain the wisdom that the soul has gained so far. So those two names are given. Okay, a law warden shall hold office for no more than 20 years, and he shall be voted into office when he is not under 50 years of age. Now, on one level, this is something arbitrary, these numbers thrown out. People develop at different rates. Some people can be doing philosophy all their life, and they see value in it, but it never quite takes hold. Whereas another person, when they first discover Plato, it's like, a fish finding water, and they just take to it and they just take off like that. And so people develop at different rates, if you will. This idea of 50 years of age, though, does seem to be significant to Plato in the Republic as well. He gives the stages of growth in Book 7. And the highest stage, that peak of developing full wisdom, that highest experience, developing wisdom or being what we might call enlightened, is at 50 years of age, and that's at 540a, I believe. Okay, and he goes on from the law wardens then to talk about the commanders. So whereas the law wardens represent that wisdom-loving part of the soul, the commanders represent that passionate part of the soul. And this is the home of courage. And he says the commanders must be selected next. Commanders shall be nominated by the law wardens from among the members of our state only. And from those nominated, the selection shall be made by all who either are serving or have served in war, according to their several ages. So Plato regularly uses war as an image of that courage in the soul that is sort of fighting against pleasures and pains that are trying to take us away from a life of wisdom. And the boule, or council, shall consist of 30 dozen, as the number 360 is well adapted for the subdivisions. They shall be divided into 4 groups, and 90 counselors shall be voted for from each of the property classes. So again, picking a number that can be divided up very nicely in many different ways, and we'll see this number as well coming up in various places throughout the book. And again, I think that it ties into that whole idea of the certain harmony and balance in the soul. The selection of officials that is thus made will form a mean between a monarchic constitution, and a democratic. And midway between these, our constitution should always stand. This idea was first introduced back in Book 3. We saw the idea of the monarchy fits with the aristocracy and the republic, the idea of the philosopher king being guided by wisdom. Here, he's using democratic in a far nicer way, a more positive way than he did in the republic. There we saw the idea of freedom running amok when the desires are not necessarily in line with wisdom and we don't really care what is healthy or unhealthy for the soul. It's a kind of addiction, really, where you're sort of chasing every whim and you're not really in control. But the way he talks about it in the laws is in balance with the idea of temperance or sophrosun. When the desires naturally fall in line with wisdom, then we can act in a way that is free but also healthy, and there's a certain friendship in the soul. And so that's what he means by democratic. That was discussed far more in Book 3. So if you need a refresher on that, there is a video on that from a few weeks ago. Okay, now he's going to go on to talk about due measure. Now, this ties in, he doesn't tie it in here with metaphysics, at least not on the surface, but I do think you need to have Platonic metaphysics in mind as you're reading this. It will bring far more meaning to it. So the idea of due measure is that there's a certain incommensurability between the various realms of reality. And so what that means is, for example, our physical realm is infinite, both in space and in time. It's infinite in its essence. And yet, even though it is infinite, we can still talk about realms that are beyond it. They are incommensurate with this realm, and each realm is infinite in its own proper power and in its own proper essence. And yet, there's still a realm of beyond it until you finally get to the first cause of all, which is beyond all the realms and is incommensurate with all of them. And so this idea of due measure, that each realm is in its own proper way what it is, and yet they're not quite equitable to one another. This idea is important to keep in mind. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we're going through these next few slides. When equality is given to unequal things, the resultant will be unequal unless due measure is applied. And it is because of these two conditions that political organizations are filled with feuds. There is an old and true saying that equality produces amity, which is right well and fitly spoken. But what the equality is which is capable of doing this is a very troublesome question, since it is very far from being clear. For there are two kinds of equality, which, though identical in name, are often almost opposites in their practical results. The one of these any state or lawgiver is competent to apply in the assignment of honors, namely the equality determined by measure, weight, and number, simply by employing the lot to give even results in the distributions. But the truest and best form of equality is not an easy thing for anyone to discern. Okay, so usually when we think of equality, we think of that everyone gets the same, or at least everyone has the same opportunities. And that's certainly what we want from our government. But when we're looking at metaphysics and we're looking at our own spiritual practice, we do have to understand this idea of due measure, and that means the other kind of equality. And he says, it is the judgment of Zeus, and people it never assists, save in small measure. But insofar as it does assist either states or individuals, it produces all things good, for it dispenses more to the greater and less to the smaller, giving due measure to each according to nature, and with regard to honors also, by granting the greater to those that are greater in goodness, and the less to those of the opposite character in respect of goodness and education, it assigns in proportion what is fitting to each. So if this idea is assigned in a political context, if it's taken on the surface story, it's very problematic, we can see, because oftentimes governments will try to rationalize why they give less to certain ethnic groups or certain races. This, of course, is not what Plato is talking about. We have to apply this to metaphysics. The law of providence states that the first cause of all being the good means that those realms that are metaphysically closer to the one or the good are receiving a greater quantity or greater amount, if you will, greater participation, I think is a better way to say it, a greater participation in goodness, in providential goodness. And then as us, as philosophy practitioners, we see that the more we bring unity to our soul, the more we clear away what is false, the more open we are to truth that carries with it a commensurate energy, which is the idea of gymnastics and music, that our state of mind is becoming healthier. That's music. It has a commensurate increase in energy, which is gymnastics, and we're able to participate in the higher realms to a greater degree. And so that's the law of providence, that we can each participate in the divine to the degree that we are able to. Excuse me, I'm tripping over my words today, sorry. So that is the law of providence. Now, to those who are participating less, they may feel it's not fair. They may feel that, they're doing certain rituals, their religion is teaching them certain teachings and certain rituals and certain beliefs, and they have that certain humility towards God that their religion taught, so why are they not able to participate more? This idea came up actually in the last book, that the way to honor the gods is not necessarily to follow certain rituals, but to be as godlike as is humanly possible, to develop the virtues, to open your soul into the ways that we've been talking about here, and to be able to participate in the divine in these higher degrees. So there is a certain justice here. Not everybody can see it, but as the further we go along, the more we can appreciate this idea of justice in due measure. And so he mentions justice then. Whoever founds a state elsewhere at any time must make the same object the aim of his legislation, not the advantage of a few tyrants or of one, or of some form of democracy, but justice always. And this consists in what we have just stated, namely the natural equality given on each occasion to things unequal. Okay, new idea here. Just as a ship when sailing on the sea requires continual watchfulness both by night and day, so likewise a state, when it lives amidst the surge of surrounding states and is in danger of being entrapped by all sorts of plots, it requires to have officers linked up with officers from day to night and from night to day, in guardians succeeding guardians, and being succeeded in turn without a break. So we can probably already feel here the image of the philosopher trying to live in society, being surrounded by people who maybe don't understand our way of thinking and our way of life, and we feel like we're always in danger of being entrapped by all sorts of plots. So we have to be constantly guarding our state of mind. And the 60, referring back to the 360 that was divided up in many different ways, the 60 must guard each their own district, not only because of enemies, but in view also of those who profess to be friends. So as we're watching our state of mind, we have to see not only the obvious fears or temptations that might pull us away from a life of wisdom, but also we have to be very careful to look at those states of mind that maybe we didn't recognize as harmful before, but as we go along, as we continue along, we'll start to see more. We'll start to question ourselves differently. And so some of our beliefs, we may have professed to be friends, but they actually are hurting us. Okay, now it is needful that everyone should hold the view regarding people in general, that the person who has not been a servant will never become a praiseworthy master, and that the right way to gain honor is by serving honorably, rather than by ruling honorably, doing service first to the laws, since this is a service to the gods. So again, this idea that we are like a conduit for divine wisdom, that we are letting it come into us and then we are simply passing it along. And this also ties into the idea of Socrates calling himself a servant of God. And also he very famously would say that the only thing he knows is that he knows nothing. And I think this ties into this idea here, that he doesn't claim the knowledge to be his own. He is simply allowing himself to be open to divine wisdom. And then he had the courage to live in the world that way, even to the point of going to his death in order to maintain that it was true and right. So with this idea in mind, This Athenian stranger gives us the role of the city stewards, and this is in charge of all the water supplies. And so this image of wisdom flowing into us opens itself very easily to the idea of water coming in. And we see that this water, this wisdom, should be pure and plentiful. And when it comes into our city or into our soul, it should both beautify and benefit the soul of the city. The Athenian stranger then goes on to talk about music and gymnastics, and I think it's important to bring it back in because this is not just a preliminary stage. It's not just a purification technique. It stays with us all of our lives. We're constantly watching our state of mind, which is music, and we're constantly feeling our energy increasing as we go up that steep ascent, as we go out into the upper world. Even in the upper world, there are levels, or there are stages that we go through. First, we're looking at things only at night because our eyes haven't adjusted to the brightness. Gradually, they do adjust. We can look at maybe reflections in water, and there are various stages that he goes through in the Republic until eventually it peaks with seeing the sun itself in its own place. Each of those stages or steps along the way is an increase in energy, and so that's gymnastics. And he says there are 2 grades for each department, one for education, the other for managing competitions. So there's the actual learning or growing, the nurturing, and then actually applying it, the competitions. So all those who are devoted to these subjects shall attend the assembly, and if they refuse to attend, they shall be liable to a fine, a matter which the law wardens shall decide. Any others who are unwilling to attend shall be subject to no compulsion. So if you choose to take on a life of philosophy and you go into these practices that he's calling music and gymnastics, it's not enough to just have these theories privately within you. You need to act on it. You have to attend the assembly, so to speak. We encourage other people to come into a life of philosophy, but there is no compulsion. In the department we have been dealing with, we have still to appoint an officer who shall preside over the whole range of education of both boys and girls. For this purpose there shall be one officer legally appointed. He shall not be under 50 years of age, so there's that number again, and he shall be the father of legitimate children of either sex, or preferably of both sexes. I'm going to pause for a moment to remind you that in this analogy of the city-state to the soul, children have been representing insights. And so, of course, we want legitimate children or legitimate, healthy insights. Right? Both the candidate that is put first and the elector who puts him first must be convinced that of the highest offices of the state, this is by far the most important. For in the case of every creature, plant or animal, tame and wild alike, it is the first shoot, if it sprouts out well, that is most effective in bringing to its proper development the essential excellence, I tripped over that one again, the essential excellence of the creature in question. So again, we want to plant the right seeds. We want our insights to be healthy insights. Man, as we affirm, is a tame creature. Nonetheless, while he is wont to become an animal most godlike and tame when he happens to possess a happy nature combined with right education, if his training be deficient or bad, he turns out the wildest of all of earth's creatures. And so Plato there is describing that whole range of human nature. If what he's saying is right, then why are there so many awful people in the world, so many people who do such harmful, hurtful things in the world? Why is there so much evil in the world? And it's ignorance. That ignorance or wisdom determines how we turn out. And so this idea of right education then takes on an even more meaningful role. We really need this in our society now. A state indeed would be no state if it had no law courts properly established. So now he's going on to a new topic, law courts. And what does he mean by that? The matter in dispute on either side must always be made clear, and for elucidating the point at issue, lapse of time, deliberation, and frequent questionings are of advantage. What he's describing here, what he's making his parallel to the idea of law courts, is really the whole philosophic life. The idea of frequent questionings, I'm going to take it backwards. Frequent questionings, that could be in the form of formal dialectic, it could be more informal. Maybe you're questioning yourself, maybe you're talking with friends sometimes. Either way, that's a lot of how philosophy plays itself out. And then deliberation, contemplating, turning it inward, struggling with your questions. And there's a lapse of time. We have to keep coming back to our questions over and over. We're not necessarily going to get the question the first time we tackle it. Some of it has to do with having other insights that are going to, when you come back to a certain issue after you've had other insights, now you can see it differently. It also has to do with that idea of building energy and maturing your state of mind. All of this ties in together, and it allows you to elucidate the point at issue, the philosophical issue that you're battling. And so what he's calling these law courts, the battles that go on in law courts, is very much the whole philosophical life at this stage of our journey. In the matter of offenses against the state, it is necessary, first of all, that a share in the trial should be given to the populace. For when a wrong is done to the state, it is the whole of the people that are wronged, and they would justly be vexed if they had no share in such trials. So while it is right that both the beginning and the ending of such a suit should be assigned to the people, the examination shall take place before 3 of the highest officials, mutually agreed upon by both defendant and plaintiff. Should they be unable by themselves to reach an agreement, the council must revise the choice of each of them. What I think of when I'm reading this is the idea that when an injustice is committed against us, it affects the whole soul. And we have to acknowledge that wrong that's been committed, and we have to treat our anger with a certain integrity. I think that our culture has an idea that we should immediately jump to forgiveness, and it's a virtue to forgive, and you should not be angry. But the truth is, anger is a stage we have to pass through. We have to acknowledge the wrong, because all anger is rooted in perceptions of injustice. And so to bring integrity to show integrity to yourself, you have to acknowledge that you've been wronged. You don't have to dismiss yourself as if I don't count and I shouldn't be angry and put other people first. You have a right to acknowledge that you've been wronged. But this idea, then he takes it a step further, saying that the examination is not done by the people who've been wronged. It's done by 3 of the highest officials. And this is because, I think it's because righteous indignation is not the same as truly being right or being guided by wisdom. We have to acknowledge that anger, but then there's a next step of letting it go and thinking about what is wisest in that situation. I mean, this is a very broad topic, and so I'm not really doing it justice here, but I mean, there are many ways that it plays itself out depending on the particular wrong. But we do need to approach it with a certain wisdom that allows us to separate from the pain and try to see it more clearly. And so that's why it is not the people making the decision, but the 3 of the highest officials. Yet we still have to bring all the people in, if you will, acknowledge the wrong that's been done and how it's affected the whole soul. So here he's talking about offenses against the state. He then goes on to private suits. And I think what he means by private suits is that sometimes we commit injustices against ourselves because of our false beliefs, whether it's in the form of like dismissing ourselves or through our insecurities, our injustices against ourselves. Nobody is less than anyone else. If you ever walk away from a person thinking that person is better than me, you're committing an injustice against yourself. And so we need to see that as well and be honest with ourselves about it. So in our private suits also, so far as possible, all the citizens must have a share. For the person that has no share in helping to judge imagines that he has no part or lot in the state at all. Okay, let us address them thus. Beloved keepers of the laws, in many departments of our legislation we shall leave out a vast number of matters, for we needs must do so. Yet, notwithstanding all important matters as well as the general description, we shall include, so far as we can, in our outline sketch. Your help will be required to fill in this outline. and you must listen to what I say about the aim you should have before you in doing so. So now Plato is bringing in a certain openness, a flexibility, if you will. And I see this in two different ways. One is because we are a work in progress, and so we're constantly going to be developing and maybe tweaking our insights along the way. Also, I think it also plays out in the fact that even though Plato is not a relativist, he doesn't just say that whatever you think is right really is true, it's true for you. He doesn't say that. There is such a thing as truth and goodness, yet he also recognizes that it's going to reflect itself, it's going to express itself differently in different people. And so there is a certain flexibility required and a certain wisdom required to recognize how the same truth can express itself differently through different people. And it is, as we said, necessary that in regard to all matters involving a host of petty details, the lawgiver should leave omissions, and that rules and amendments should be made from year to year by those who have constant experience of them, so we're living them, from year to year and are taught by practice, until it be decided that a satisfactory code has been made out to regulate all such proceedings. So that again is that idea of that trial and error that we're going through as we go along through life. And I think this continues all of our lives. I imagine, I don't think there's any end, that we never reach a point where we're as wise as we can possibly be. There's always more to do and always more to think about. And so these constant tweakings that go on. And now he goes on to marriage. Now marriage is an interesting idea because it's about unity. Not only the two people getting married or forming a union, but also even their families come together as in-laws and form one big family. So it's all one big unity. So marriage in this analogy is talking about bringing unity to the soul. So regarding marriage as a whole, there shall be one general rule. Each man must seek to form such a marriage as shall benefit the state, rather than such as best pleases himself. Now, of course, taken on the surface, that's very troubling, but now we know to see this as an analogy to the soul, and I think it's very easy to understand what he's saying here. He goes on to say that there is a natural tendency for everyone to make for the mate that most resembles himself, whence it results that the whole state becomes ill-balanced, both in wealth and in moral habits. And because of this, the consequences we least desire are those that generally befall most states. We can see this on the surface area, that we do tend to be drawn to people who share our interests, who share our way of life, our way of thinking, our way of being. And sometimes we can be a little unbalanced. And so there's something nice about finding people who complement you, who share your values, but in a way that is complementary to you. And then we also, on the level of soul, we need to have that sort of balance. I think people drawn to Platonic philosophy tend to be people who really like the logic side of it, who tend to approach life in a way that is logical, and we like the argumentation of it, or the contemplation side of it. Some of us maybe not so good with interacting with other people in a social setting, or I think there's a false image of Platonism being about repressing your emotions or denying emotions or thinking of emotions as something negative or bad that need to be overcome. And I think that ties into the wrong understanding of temperance. But what we want is something more balanced. We understand that all of our behaviors and our attitudes, and including our feelings, are rooted in our beliefs. The more we open up our beliefs, and the more we question our beliefs and develop healthy beliefs, the more we'll find that we don't have to fear our emotions or be uncomfortable with them, and we can have a more balanced life where we can be both rational and emotional in a way that is healthy. And so we want that balance in our soul and in our relationships. Now, in the middle of this conversation about marriage, and it does get, I think, a bit dry, where there's lots of different rules about marriage, and he goes on for pages and pages. In fact, if I go back just one, you can see from 773b, It goes on for a few pages to 775e. In the middle of it all, this sentence just pops out. And if you're thinking of metaphysics while you're reading this, then it takes on a whole new meaning. He says, "The beginning that sits enshrined as a goddess among mortals is a savior of all, provided that she receives the honor due to her from each one who approaches her." Now, I put the Greek for beginning because arche is the word that's used in metaphysics, often translated as cause or principle, and it's the word that describes that first principle of all, the one or the good. And so that is what sits enshrined as a goddess among mortals. It is their savior. And if we approach it with its proper due honor, then it will be our savior. So this is just thrown in the middle of a discussion of marriage. So the idea of bringing unity to the soul, and then this sentence pops out. Here is a statement about servants. I brought this in partly because it is a very, very famous statement, maybe one of the most famous ideas tied to Plato. Proper treatment of servants consists in using no violence towards them and in hurting them even less, if possible, than our own equals. For it is his way of dealing with people whom it is easy for him to wrong that shows most clearly whether a person is genuine or hypocritical in his reverence for justice and hatred for injustice. A wall is by no means an advantage to a city as regards health, and moreover, it usually causes a soft habit of soul in the inhabitants by inviting them to seek refuge within it instead of repelling the enemy. So we need to be courageous. Instead of securing their safety by keeping watch night and day, it tempts them to believe that their safety is ensured if they're fenced in with walls and gates and go to sleep, like men born to shirk toil, little knowing that ease is really the fruit of toil, whereas a new crop of toils is the inevitable outcome, as I think, of dishonorable ease and sloth. So again, taken on the surface, it can be quite troublesome, but looking at this through the eyes of philosophy and as our practice of developing the soul, we see that what he's saying here is that our efforts in philosophy may bring us some friction and cause us some difficulties, and when unhealthy beliefs are surfacing, it can be very uncomfortable. But we don't want to just take it easy. We don't want to push it away. We don't want to surround ourselves with people that don't challenge us and challenge our ideas, because that toil, that effort that we're putting is what gives us growth. And if you've ever met anyone who is truly wise, whether it's a Platonic philosopher or it's a Buddhist Roshi or a teacher from another system, that person has a certain buoyancy to their personality. And we tend to want to replicate that or imitate that, but we can't just jump to that state of mind. That behavior is a reflection of that healthy state of mind, which that person has maintained or is able to enjoy because of the effort that person had put in years ago. So I can tell you that I feel more buoyancy in my heart now than I did 20 years ago when I first found Plato, and I hope to continue along, but I know that it is the effort and the struggles that I go through in tackling the questions that I still have that is going to bring that about. And so that's what he's talking about here. Okay, now the production of children. Again, the idea of children representing insights. So we've brought a certain unity to the soul that we're calling marriage. So the next obvious thing is having insights. So let us place the subject of the production of children next, after that of marriage, and after their production, their nurture and education. And so here's what he says about that. That the bride and bridegroom must set their minds to produce for the state children of the greatest possible goodness and beauty. So again, thinking of that as insights. We want to have insights of the greatest possible goodness and beauty. All people that are partners in any action produce results that are fair and good, whensoever they apply their minds to themselves and the action. But the opposite results when either they have no minds or they fail to apply them. So again, that is the philosophical life, and for Plato, that is the spiritual life, the life that brings us more in line with divine goodness, applying our minds to ourselves, looking at our own beliefs, and also to our actions and to the world around us and to all of our philosophical questions. Okay, so that brings us to the end of book 6. As always, if you like what you're seeing, I would appreciate a thumbs up. It does help the algorithm. And also, as always, if you don't already subscribe, I hope you'll think about doing so and think about sharing with your friends, and always feel free to comment. So thank you very much, and I do hope that you'll join me next week when I go over book 7.